Second speeches will begin with the affirmative, and you may start when you're ready.
Should I wait for the...
They are standing right there.
Oh,
I said
okay.
to go right ahead.
Okay, perfect. Okay. Really quickly before I begin, I want to extend...
Hold the microphone. Yeah.
Before I begin, I want to extend 2 additional really brief thank yous. First, to my family, who Rahul was not able to thank, and second, to the other members of my team sitting up here. With that, good to go. Let's begin. First off, a couple of key observations on how we want to frame the round. First of all, on what adoption means. We would contend that a prerequisite to adoption is an existing legally binding climate agreement. This is really important. We contend that the negative world is one where there is a legally binding agreement without enforcement and binding enforcement mechanisms, and we contend that the affirmative one is where where enforcement mechanisms are added or adopted. Second of all, we observe that when you're weighing the impacts in the round, you will always prefer compliance to participation. This is because, first of all, compliance is what directly leads to tangible impacts. Complying with environmental agreements is what takes emissions out of the air. It's what creates actual positive good. But secondly, and more importantly, we would contend that participating without complying across the board is not only ineffective because it doesn't tangibly reduce emissions, but more problematically, it presents a hollow hope that we are taking effective steps to climate change when in reality, we are not. We would contend that that is even worse. But then, third, we would say that every sliding scale step that you take towards less emissions is good, period. That's really important because if we reduce emissions at all, that's good. It doesn't matter if they also reduce emissions. If we reduce emissions more, that's even better because at the end of the day, we would contend that climate change is such a big issue that the status quo is not working well enough. We need to try as much as possible to mitigate emissions in order to prevent the massive negative impacts of climate change. With that, let's go into their 3 observations. First of all, they talk about sanctions against larger countries. 2 things. First, we would contend that although in the status quo it's unlikely for a country like the United States to be sanctioned by the rest of the world, when you have something with as much political clout as a climate change agreement with binding enforcement mechanisms, that changes. That's because it's not the United States versus a particular country, it's the rest of the world versus the United States. The rest of the world is still a much larger trading bloc. But then, second, when they make this EU argument saying that the EU is a block of trade, the EU also has shared tradable permit programs right now, so the EU would enter agreements as a bloc. This is not relevant. But third, when they talk about positive measures not being topical, they don't really warrant this. We would contend, as Ulay explains, that at the end of the day, any part of an agreement that incentivizes compliance is an enforcement mechanism. If you get money for complying with something, that law is being enforced, or if you're not having money taken away from you, that law is equally being enforced. With that, let's get into their first argument about participation. They make 2 warrants about sovereignty and economic harms. You can group both of these together because all of their examples talk about legally binding agreements. This is really important. What they're talking about is the addition of legally binding the addition of a legally binding clause being damaging to sovereignty and having economic harms. What we're saying is we add enforcement mechanisms. The difference is crucial because it's political suicide for a country to have to ratify a treaty as legally binding. That's the infringement of sovereignty. It is not political suicide to add enforcement mechanisms to an already legally binding treaty like Paris is. Paris was already signed. We bite the harms, they've already occurred. But second, on economic harms. First of all, we would contend that at the end of the day, the economic harms of actual climate change are substantially worse. But second of all, that any trade sanctions, any economic impacts of trade sanctions that are happen would most likely not manifest in most scenarios. That's because they are strongly deterrent. That's the point of incentives. Sure, some people break the law and some people pay speeding tickets, but not everyone has to fear a $100 speeding ticket every time they drive. At the end of the day, most people are incurring the economic harms because sanctions are acting as a deterrent effect. But then third, they talk about developing countries footing the bill. We would contend that this is a good thing. This goes back to the end of our own case where we talk about the equal applicability of the rule of law. We would say that right now, developing nations both disproportionately bite the impact and disproportionately bite the blame for current climate environmental accords. We would say that larger countries need to do more to foot the bill. They're saying that larger countries won't join. The reason why this is important is because the definition at the top explains that we are adopting enforcement mechanisms into an already existing climate agreement. That means countries like the United States have to walk away from the table, not join in the first place. This is a really important distinction because the political loss of walking away from the table, of saying I don't want progress, is a lot more significant than not joining up with an agreement in the first place. That's why the United States leaving Paris was such a massive deal, but the United States failing to comply with Paris flew under the radar year after year. Then they talk about China and the United States. First of all, on the United States. The United States is already not part of Paris. We would contend that the reason why is Trump was scared of like parity in the agreement. He wanted more countries to comply, so we saw for that. But second, on China, we would say if China is going to comply in either world, they're going to comply. But if they're going to comply, they would rather reap the positive benefits of being part of the agreement. Essentially, if you're going to comply, you might as well be part of the agreement. If you're not going to comply, you're not going to comply, and you're going to take the hit. Then, on their second point about compliance, both the international peer pressure and the domestic pressure exist in both worlds. This is really important. We're adding binding enforcement mechanisms on top of already existing peer pressure, which means we only increase compliance. That is the entirety of the affirmative case. For those reasons, we proudly stand in affirmation.
Thank you.